There's no apology for repeating a slide I've used quite a few times, because I still find myself having to have this conversation with people around the issue of modern slavery. I wish we could move the agenda on to understand more about what we can do, more about the practicalities, and hopefully over the course of the rest of the morning and this afternoon particularly, we'll look about the practicalities of how we can address this issue. But we're still here in the work that we do. It's not really happening in the UK. And really, to pick up on some of the points that were made this morning, it does happen. A good friend of mine who's worked in the supply into the agricultural sector for over 20 years continues to say, it's there, I've just not found it yet. He's found it, he's dealt with it, and he does do on a daily, weekly and yearly basis. But we need to remember that it will be there somewhere. It's just using your business, your knowledge, your insights, your intelligence, your structure to identify where that is. And then importantly, what are you going to do about it? Because the one thing to remember, talking about margins, individuals, victims, if you're going to squeeze your margins, the easiest place to squeeze it to the very end is with the workforce. The example that Ben gave this morning is indicative of the conversations I think that must be had in many businesses. What can we do to drive down costs, and where can we look to increase the profit margin? Now, I'm not from business. I understand the pressures financially and commercially, but the bottom line is the worker is the one that is likely to be squeezed the most. So it's there, we need to look for it, and when we find it, we need to report it. The construction protocol that we introduced sets, in our mind, the conversation running with the construction sector, using the lessons learned from our engagement with the agricultural sector over the previous 10 and 12 years to generate a conversation around what we can do to meet our mission statement of protecting vulnerable people. Because it's vulnerability that's preyed upon that allows these people to infiltrate supply chains, to create profit for themselves at the expense of the life of an individual. And it is the life of an individual that's impacted mostly around what we see in the work that we do. But the construction protocol was very simply an idea to generate a conversation about a shared responsibility to discuss this subject openly, an open dialogue around the issues we're trying to tackle, and most importantly, what are we going to do about it? It's clear that we can't do this alone. We are a small government agency as part of the Home Office. We can't change the world. You alone potentially can't change the world, but using respective skills, information, and understanding of supply chains, we can actually make a real difference. And that is the pivotal purpose of the protocol and what we're trying to do. But we are intelligence-led as an authority. And I'll talk a little bit about intelligence and what we do with it when we receive it, and also a little bit about what the intelligence is actually telling us at the moment, just to illustrate how effective it can be to have that open dialogue, because intelligence in relation to construction is increasing and coming into us. But we're getting a better picture of the industry that many tell us is one of the worst industries around modern slavery. I don't believe that to be true. I just think it's one of the many that's impacted around this subject. I don't think there's a best and a worst. I think there's just a problem that we've got. The protocol, since it's launched about this time last year, we've now got 34 signatories. Now, for some, 34 might not sound a lot of businesses, authorities, bodies that have signed up, but the reach is immense. The financial impact of the businesses that we have around the table can drive change. The trade associations, the bodies that are signed up to this, can drive real influence and change. And it's continuing to grow. Businesses are continuing to sign up. And the benefit of all is that shared picture of what we see in the UK today. We will share information. We will not share the crown jewels of any intelligence picture. But what we want to do is talk around what we're seeing. What areas of business are we seeing the greatest problem? What's the modus operandi of the exploiter? How can we then get into that supply chain to understand where we can apply pressure to change that behaviour? And having set this up and been involved in the early meetings, and a colleague of mine, Sam Ireland, for those that don't know Sam, have actually generated a conversation that has grown at a real pace. It's been a surprise to all of us that have been involved with it, I think, just what traction we've gained. Perhaps in an area where there hasn't been an awful lot of constructive dialogue between partners in the industry. And if we've been able to bridge that gap, at least it started that journey. But our intelligence unit is based at our head office in Nottingham, and it's based upon the same principles as all law enforcement in the UK. It follows what's called the National Intelligence Model, and people talk about intelligence, get really scared about intelligence. But it's the lifeblood for what I do within the authority, but equally it's the lifeblood for what you do. You create intelligence through your analysis of your business, through the conversations with your management structure, through the way that you spend your money. You're creating a picture of what's happening within your supply chain. And that intelligence is graded, evaluated, used to assess risk in exactly the same way that law enforcement apply a model to grade and assess risk. But what we need to do as an authority is to make sure that intelligence is driving our activity in the right way. And our plea to all businesses, and particularly those within the construction sector, is to understand what you're seeing, and if you've got an issue, report it. We will then assess what we've got, we'll look to verify and corroborate what we've got, we will build an intelligence picture that can then direct the activity of our investigative staff. But also then, in my area of work at the moment, to drive the activity of where we can get into businesses to help prevent the exploitation of labour. If we make it really difficult for the criminal enterprises that are there to operate, they may move elsewhere. One of the things I want businesses to do on the back of intelligence is actually ask some searching questions. Don't be so quite so accepting of the first thing that you see. If you think there's an issue, explore it. If there's an issue then that causes you concern, report it, and we'll have a conversation about it. But whatever you do, don't bury bad news. The way that the perpetrators continue to operate is the fact that we keep information to ourselves. Intelligence needs to be shared, discussed openly, constructively, and use it as the bedrock for that conversation. So when intelligence comes in, it's a fairly simple process map. Now, every government department likes a process map, but it's really just to assess the information. What are we being told? Where is the risk and harm? What does that information tell us about where the greatest risk to that vulnerable worker is? Are there any aggravating factors? Is there something which really does escalate this issue above and beyond other information that's coming in? Within that, are there any modern slavery indicators? Because then it starts to raise the pressure on us as an authority to do something practical about that. There is going to be a victim at the end of the line, and I think it's been mentioned this morning, and we should never forget it. All of the work we do, there will be somebody there that is subject to significant labour exploitation all the way up to modern slavery. But then, to manage our resources, we need to give that information a score. Now, it's very easy to say, well, we'll score it in this way, we'll have this, so much for this, so much for that, and so much for everything else. But our scoring mechanism is based simply on the information that you give in. If you give information around, I've seen these people on a site and they're all looking quite miserable and it's raining, they've not got protective clothing on, that's great. But if you know how long they've been on site, how they get there, who's looking after them, who's the supplier of the labour, is there anything else you know about the transportation, the accommodation, the way they conduct themselves that builds that picture, it starts to increase the score. And if there is an indication of modern slavery, don't be frightened to say so. The conversations this morning that Ben had had and victims had had with law enforcement, unless you actually say in its entirety what's happening, we really are making guesswork. You can put a few pieces together, But the more that we get in, the better picture we get, and the more we can do something about it. But when we've assessed and assimilated that information, we will produce a report, a package, call it what you will, for law enforcement, both for ourselves and for our partners to take forward. But every piece of information will come in, we'll assess it, we'll treat it in the same way, and it is secure. One of the conversations that I've had over the years with businesses is, well, we don't want to report anything in because we don't know what happens to that information. We are not going to tell people who's phoning us up and giving us information. It's not in our interest to do so. It's certainly not in your interest. You can be assured that intelligence is dealt with properly, with integrity, the processes are robust. We are lawfully bound to deal with it in a certain way. The powers that we have are based upon us operating our powers correctly. So therefore, you can be assured that it's dealt with as you'd expect. There are all sorts of methodologies around the grading of intelligence. The latest one is something that's known 3 by 5 by 2. One or two of you might be familiar with 5 by 5 by 5, and there'll be something else in a couple of years' time. But it's all around the assessment. The key thing for me is, what level of information do we get, and how assured can we be that you know as the reporter that this is really happening? We can't ask you specifically about a case to task you to go and find something out. So if you phone me up and you're telling me that you've got this information around a group of workers, it would be really nice for me as a member of the public to say, well, if you want to just follow them home one night and see where they are, that'd be a real great help to us. We can't do that. I'm not here to say to you, we want you to do anything over and above what you would expect to do. Report what you see. Do not put yourself in a position of danger. Do not raise the risk to you, the worker, or anybody else within that environment. But the more information that you can give us, the easier it is for us to do something about it. So look at what's happening, ask questions, be challenging, and be robust in that challenging process. What's good information? Clear, concise, understandable, corroborated. What can we do to make sure that we understand the full intelligence picture? The more detail we get at the initial stage, the more we can help you work through an issue, because we will always work with a business that thinks it's got a problem. The vast majority of businesses that we work with are compliant, legitimate, lawful business enterprises who want to make a profit without the exploitation of workers. We will work with you wherever we can and whenever we can to tackle that issue together. We are not on a different side. Policing isn't on a different side. The NGOs aren't on a different side. We're actually doing the same thing in our own way. By pooling and sharing that information will actually make the difference we're here to do. We will continue to review. We will continue to refresh. We will get to know more about what's happening. We have to share it. One of the questions we're asked again, who do you share it with? If we have information that we need to share with our partner agencies, we will do so. There will be information that will be appropriate to the National Minimum Wage team, to police, to immigration enforcement. The protection of the vulnerable is the key message. Don't hide behind the fact I don't want to report any intelligence in. One of the things that I repeat an awful lot as well as around the myths and realities is this belief that, well, I don't have to report it because it's not really my job, whether I'm an auditor or whether I'm a procurement manager or whatever it is. It's somebody else's job to do it. Well, actually, you're the eyes and ears for that victim, because if you don't, who else is going to do that? Don't be frightened to report it. If you've got a situation where you observe somebody stealing something out of somebody's pocket within the workplace, you're likely going to report that. Then when people say to me, well, I'd report that, but I wouldn't report the fact that these people are clearly working 17 hours a day, they're not being fed, they're working 7 days a week, and they are malnourished, why would you not report that? Your moral obligation, your business obligation, your social justice obligation would tell you that that is the right thing to do. So don't hide behind the fact that intelligence might be misconstrued, not used properly. Use the intelligence to drive that activity. Obviously, there'll be a panel Q&A a little bit later on. We'll have some questions, no doubt. But just to give you a flavour of some of the issues that we're finding at the moment, one or two of the cases that we've got, we understand and seeing a predominance of exploitation within the Romanian community. One of the areas that we're seeing an increase is newly created Eastern European businesses appearing on the scene to supply labour, to supply goods, to supply services, with little business history, promising an awful lot as a business. We're seeing cases at the moment with businesses in their supply chain that are household names. So don't think you can rest easy if you are a household name, because there's somewhere in your supply chain there will be a risk. Seeing a real increase in activity at the third tier of supply and below. Now, you're not alone with this, because when we've dealt with the agricultural sector in years gone by, they have some problems at first and second tier, but when you start to subcontract, when you start to rely upon a labour workforce that goes down third, fourth, fifth tier, it gets to be a very murky world. All-round services, goods and provision, logistics, finishers, cleaners, site work, it's all there to be addressed. So do something positive, work with the GLAA, but more importantly, work together to have that conversation. Thank you.